Well, hello, listeners, and welcome back to the RxPerts Podcast. I am Carol Motycka, your host, bringing you interesting guests who will share their perspectives and expertise regarding topics surrounding the profession of pharmacy. So today we have with us a very special guest, Rachel Waters. She's going to be discussing PRN today. So for those of you who may not be familiar, PRN does stand for Professional Recovery Network. And there are really a lot of misconceptions that surround PRN. So I wanted to bring an expert on here to really be able to provide us some of that information and clarification that you all are looking for and really work through some of the nuances. So Rachel, thank you for taking the time to discuss this important topic with our students.
Of course. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So give us a little bit of background about yourself and what really made you want to help professionals through PRN?
Absolutely. So, I am a licensed mental health counselor. I have been working at the UF Health, specifically at the Florida Recovery Center, for 10 years. And my background has always been working within mental health and substance abuse treatment. And so, the work that I do here at the Florida Recovery Center really has focused on working with safety sensitive professionals, those under monitoring, and the Professionals Resource Network in treating substance use and mental health. And so my kind of passion or niche kind of came in from being a therapist and getting more involved in, understanding, the whys behind it, what goes on, within board hearings and all of that. And so, I've just kind of grown into really appreciating and understanding, what we need to do to protect people and in their license. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. And we talk a little bit about what's called a safety sensitive professional. So why is that important when we're addressing both mental health as well as substance use disorder?
Yes. So the term safety sensitive professional, we would think of somebody, who is under monitoring or who has a license, somebody whose job is by nature something that you do for the public. And so when you think about substance use or mental health, impairment, if somebody's under the influence or somebody is struggling, the idea of how they could impact their career or the public really comes into play more than any other medical field. If I'm sick in another way, yes, that could impact my job and the public. However, there's just another element of mental health and substance use. So if I am a pharmacist and I come in under the influence of a substance and I make a mistake, the ramifications that could have on the public are so important to pay attention to. And so, safety sensitive professional really talks about a group of individuals, whether it's healthcare or not. I mean, really, when you think about it, police officers, firefighters,
Pilots.
truck drivers, pilots, absolutely. All of these people we would define as safety sensitive, and pharmacists fall under that.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. So what exactly is PRN and how does it help health professionals?
Yes. Okay. So PRN is specific to the state of Florida. And just to give a little bit of background, every state sometimes has different organizations that they work with through their, the Board of Pharmacy or the Board of Medicine. And so, specific to the state of Florida, Professionals Resource Network is an agency. So, it is a nonprofit 501c3. They have been around since the 80s. And so, they actually came about as the Board of Medicine recognizing that they needed a support system for individuals who were struggling, separate from the Board of Medicine. And so the agency was created for that support, for that advocacy, for that monitoring piece. And so I think they oversee about 33 boards, including the Board of Pharmacy. They do include students in that. So there's, a ton of people that the Professionals Resource Network can assist. Trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to share, but that's the main part for who they are.
Sure. Well, thank you. So you talked a little bit about which health professionals that they serve. So can any health professional use their services and how would they go about that?
Yes. Okay. So for a licensed individual under those 33 boards, they could receive services through PRN. The main difference in the state of Florida that is not covered in PRN is nurses. And so that's just a different program. But for pharmacists, for pharmacy techs, for students in school, they could absolutely utilize those services through PRN. There's a couple different ways that people get, involved with them. One is if an individual knows that they're struggling and they call and they say, hey, I need some support. What do you guys suggest? What resources are out there? So basically a self-report, they would call the number and get that help. The other way that people get involved is unfortunately if somebody calls and reports them. And if that situation, an employer could come about, and quite frankly, anybody can make a call anonymously. Obviously, it's PRN's job to vet and find out the concern and if it's relevant or if it's just somebody calling, to make an accusation. But if somebody calls and reports something and says, hey, I have a concern based on my observations or XYZ, or this concern of let's say a video count, a pill count, they would say, we would like for you to follow up and make sure that, they aren't struggling or if they need some services, because ultimately PRN wants to make sure that they're safe to practice. So they would follow up on that report.
And you made an interesting comment. So have you ever had false reports? Does that happen?
It does. I mean, I can't remember the whole statistics behind it, but somebody could make an accusation. I mean, very similar to the Department of Children and Families. If somebody wants to call and make an accusation, they can. I do remember some statistics of the entire board of medicine that will get like 55,000 calls a year. And
Wow.
only sometimes only 3,000 to 5,000 are ones that they actually follow through with.
Wow.
Now, of course, that's the whole board of medicine, not just pharmacy. But it just goes to show you, if somebody calls, they could say, and it might just be a mistake, or it might just be somebody who's angry.
Right. So can somebody from the board of pharmacy contact PRN, or is that not usually how it would work?
Yes. Yeah. So absolutely. So oftentimes, let's use maybe some examples if that's okay, because sometimes
Sure.
it's more helpful to use like specific examples. If an individual is struggling, let's say they are abusing a substance, and heaven forbid, if they're diverting from the pharmacy, if they do get in trouble for that and somebody turns them over to the board of pharmacy, basically the board of pharmacy is going to follow through with it. And ultimately, hopefully, the recommendation is that the individual get involved with PRN. So the board of pharmacy and PRN have a good relationship to say, look, as long as they're doing what they're supposed to be doing and they're following recommendations and getting the help that they need for their substance use disorder, they're not going to take any actions on their license. But the board of pharmacy will get involved to make sure that they're safe to practice and then turn them over to the PRN program for them to continue on. So absolutely.
Sure. And of course, I've been to lots of board meetings in the past, board of pharmacy meetings. And for those who have also been to them, you'll often see representatives from PRN there to support the individual or to provide information, which is something else that you do, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So they will absolutely support and advocate. And so, I know sometimes, if you don't know the ins and outs of what PRN offers, they can get the negative stigma because unfortunately they are having to give feedback and ask people, to address things that it's difficult. Let's acknowledge that, it's not always easy to go through this process. And so sometimes it gets looked at as a negative thing, but very much PRN is there to support. They want to, support people in being able to go back to work. And so they will go to the board of pharmacy and advocate for them and say, hey, this person's doing everything that they need to be doing. And we have that proof of that because we've seen them. They've submitted X, Y, and Z. And so they will go to those board hearings and advocate for people.
Sure. And you bring up another good point, which it's often very difficult for individuals who are struggling with substance use disorders to recognize that somebody is there to help them, and that ultimately that is the goal for everyone, to help them, help the public, etc. And that I think is where some of these stresses come from, and from some of the issues, I guess, surrounding some of what people are saying out there and that sort of thing. It's just a difficult situation all around. But Um,
Right.
so, one other question. We talk about insurance potentially, and I've heard people asking, well, can my insurance help in regards to PRN services? So what do you have to say about that and if insurance can be used?
Absolutely. So let me kind of explain this process. So if an individual gets involved with PRN, and let me also acknowledge PRN is not a treatment provider. And so ultimately, if there are recommendations that say, hey, we don't necessarily know what level of care of treatment you need, we want you to go see someone, right? Find out what those options are, what you need. And so PRN would recommend sometimes to go to get an evaluation or go to a treatment facility or a treatment provider. And so if an individual goes to do an evaluation, sometimes those are not covered by insurance specifically. The unfortunate part is if somebody's going to a medical facility, they're going for that reason and then they use their insurance and that's what is getting billed. If somebody's going just for licensure reasons because they're making sure they're safe to practice, they aren't billing it to the insurance company. If the evaluation says, yes, we have found that there are concerns and we are recommending some level of treatment, then somebody would go seek out those services through individual or groups or, an actual treatment program, which would then be covered by insurance. So
Makes
there's
sense.
definitely some nuances to
Mm-hmm.
it. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
when you think about it, it makes sense. Sometimes it can be frustrating because there's the financial cost that's related to it.
Sure, that's the other aspect. And if somebody maybe is struggling to pay for that evaluation, are there any type of services that can be offered to help with that?
There are some. So I do know, I believe for some individuals, like especially for students, I do know there's some in the state of Florida. And so PRN, if someone was struggling, they can ask about those options, depending on, sometimes if it's a sliding scale, things like that, they may be able to work with some individuals. Yes.
Gotcha. I know at the University of Florida, we do have funds that we set aside to help students. So, perhaps if somebody's listening and it is a student, they could find out if their university also has funds that may assist as well. So, well, thank you.
Absolutely. I will say that too. I mean, there are definitely some companies and some universities that will help pay for that.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we talked a little bit about how somebody can be referred to PRN. Was there anything else that you wanted to add in that regards? It sounds like Board of Pharmacy. It can be self-reported, or it can be, oftentimes it can be a colleague as well who maybe is concerned, or somebody working with somebody at a pharmacy, for instance, when we talk about pharmacies. But I think we covered that pretty well, so I don't think there's anything else we had to add there unless you can think of something.
Well, yeah, there's actually something that I was thinking about as you were just sharing that. So a
Sure.
couple things that I was actually just thinking about is if you are in a situation and if somebody's listening to this and they go, okay, well, I know that's not necessarily specific for me. What I would recommend some individuals to think about in the sense of if you know a colleague, or if this information is helpful because in the future you may come across this. As a licensed individual in the state of Florida, we are also required to report somebody if we know somebody is impaired in the workplace. And so if you see somebody that you're concerned about, it is absolutely okay to call and say, I'm just not 100% sure. I did see this, or I'm concerned about this based on, obviously it needs to be factual. These observations, stick to the facts. But as a licensed individual, we are obligated to report somebody that we know is impaired in the workplace. The other, thing that I was considering is that when it comes to this idea of having to report, or what we call self-report, particularly for pharmacists, it's such a daunting and kind of scary process to go through if you do know that you're struggling and you don't know how to get help and you don't know how to stop, because sometimes there's like almost a tipping point where you've kind of gotten in a little bit too far and you don't know how to get yourself out of it.
Right.
Sometimes the fear of self-reporting is so much. However, I would really challenge any individual to recognize that it's actually way better to ask for that help than for there to be potentially more negative consequences that happen. I have seen some individuals who know that they're struggling, specific to regards to diverting in the workplace. So they know they've crossed those ethical, boundaries, like very detrimental boundaries, of stealing in the workplace. And what I've seen unfortunately happen is if they end up getting caught, they are fired, they are arrested, when they could have taken action to self-report to begin with and avoided some of those other consequences. So I would just encourage people, and if you are questioning things, if you're unsure, there's no harm in looking some of this up or calling PRN anonymously and saying, hey, if this situation was going on, what would happen? Because it's always better to know what your options are.
Sure, absolutely. All right, thank you for that information. And will working with PRN affect somebody's license? You kind of touched on this, but maybe you can explain a little bit better.
Yes. So the goal of PRN really is to maintain their license. PRN is separate from the Board of Pharmacy and all the other boards that they work with. So if somebody were to call up and be involved in their care, it's completely confidential and their license is not reported to the Board of Pharmacy. So that's the goal, is for someone to be safe. And so PRN's mission really is not only to help the individual, but to protect the safety of the public. And so, there are some cases, let's say that there's an individual that is just struggling so greatly that they're unable to, whether we want to call it cooperate or follow through, that they may have to get the board involved because they say, we need that additional support because we're so concerned about this individual. But more often than not, they do not want to get the Board of Pharmacy involved. And like we had talked about earlier, if the Board of Pharmacy refers somebody to PRN, they will ultimately close their case. And they say, look, as long as we know you're doing what you need to be doing, your license should be free and clear. And so there's no action taken on somebody's license.
Great, thank you. That helps a lot. And we talk a lot about substance use disorder when we think about PRN, but it's not just substance use disorders that are referred. Can you expand upon that?
Absolutely. So other things that often come up, just mental health in general. And so when you think about the state of our, economy and our society right now, and the idea of burnout workplace, especially after COVID, I don't even know if we're allowed to say after, during, whatever period we're in right now. It's just exemplifies, the stress and the burnout that we have, the workplace hours. And so when people get to a place of just utter exhaustion, and to use the word suicide, I'll bring that up. When people get to a point where they're not sure what else to do and they're struggling with their mental health, I would argue that somebody being so, distraught to a point of thinking about a place of suicide can be just as distracting at the workplace than being under the influence of a substance. And so when I think about, needing help and seeking out what the potential impact is on my job, the mental health aspect, that piece of it is just as important. There's some other things that people obviously reach out for, whether it could be an eating disorder or boundary issues. There's definitely other areas that PRN can help with. It's not just substance abuse. That one kind of tends to take the kind of focus a lot because it's easy to identify. But there's definitely other areas that they can help with.
So other addictions such as gambling, do you handle things like pornography,
Yep,
those types of addictions?
absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's helpful. And will employers or maybe a college find out if somebody is under the care of PRN?
Yeah, so that is a tricky question because sometimes the answer is yes. Depends on the situation. So if you have, let's say, an individual who's working or even a student, if they seek out the help from PRN, I know oftentimes they are concerned about people finding out. They don't want to be judged. They don't want the stigma. They don't want any negative consequences. However, I will say PRN will speak with them and say, hey, look, we want to make sure that everything is okay. So would you be willing to sign releases? So yeah, it may be a difficult conversation, but if somebody's going back into the workplace after having struggles or currently having struggles, they want to know that the workplace is informed of what's going on and make sure that they're safe to return. Obviously, if the workplace, is the one who does the reporting to begin with,
Right.
I know as an employer myself, I would want to know that the person I referred is okay to come back, and I want to have that open line of communication. So they will, they don't just go around calling anybody. They will ask for releases, but it's scary. It's daunting knowing that maybe my boss is going to know certain things. But they do leave it as a need to know basis. So they're not going to disclose things that they don't need to.
Okay, that's really helpful. Good to know. And this is a question that, I direct oftentimes to my students, but I think to everyone. Why is it so important to reach out to PRN if you know somebody is struggling?
Oh, absolutely. So just in our world of addiction medicine, there's still such a stigma. And I think I've said that before where, we struggle sometimes to ask for help. And so it's sometimes easier for other people to see it within us than for us to do it on our own for on
No,
our
that's
own.
good.
And so, it's helpful for other people if they can see it within us to say, hey, I'm concerned about you. I'm worried. I think you need to address something. On the treatment side of things, I have seen so many individuals who have come into treatment and they go, nobody ever said anything to me, right? Or if they did, it was very much in passing. And so it's uncomfortable, especially in the workplace, to sometimes either confront an individual. You don't want to be mean. You don't want them to be upset with you. You don't want to be wrong. However, my argument to that is sometimes what if that person is struggling and they can't ask for help and you are the reason that they're then able to do something about it. If that person
Right.
is thinking about suicide, if you intervene, you could be the very thing that helps somebody. And if you're wrong, that's okay. You may be wrong and you can just let them know that you were just concerned about them. Versus the alternative is if you look the other way and say, well, it's not really my problem. I don't want to get them in trouble. What the potential implications of that could be. And so, you would rather help somebody than not.
Sure. I completely agree with that. So, is there anything you want to leave with us today and really might help people understand the importance of PRN in general? And then after that, maybe you can provide the phone number or website, some information on how they can reach
Absolutely.
out. Great.
Absolutely. So, I mean, a big takeaway I hope that anybody listening to this, thinks about is that when it comes down to it, substance abuse and mental health disorders, even if it's not impacting you, it's impacting somebody that you love, somebody that you know. 1 in 10 people suffer from a substance use disorder nowadays. I mean, I would assume the number is probably getting higher. And 1 in 5 actually have a mental health disorder. So there's no way you don't know somebody who has struggled or is struggling. And so, my hope is that nobody listening to this doesn't need it. Let's hope that's the case. Chances are somebody knows somebody, or it may be the individual who's listening today. And so, just be mindful of that and how you can help somebody else, and the bigger picture of, what this could mean for that individual's life.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. So do you have, and we can leave it with everyone in regards to the notes and stuff like that, but how do they find you? How do they find PRN?
Okay, so one thing I will say, I can give the direct number to PRN. Also,
That
if
would be
you just
great.
go online and Google the Professionals Resource Network, they have an 800 number.
Perfect.
But if you can include it, so the direct number is 904-277-8004. And you can
Okay.
talk to somebody, at any point, if they say, hey, you need to, just get to the intake counselor. I will say, so I do not work directly for PRN. So I work for the UF Health Florida Recovery Center. And so if somebody wanted to find me, I'm on the Florida Recovery Center website. I'm more than happy to share my email as well if somebody wanted to reach out to me directly. I don't necessarily, if somebody has any questions or something specific, and if they say, Rachel, what does this sound like? I am always more than happy to help because I think oftentimes when people get involved in this, they don't know who to talk to. They don't know who to
Right.
ask for help. So I'm always happy to be a resource to somebody.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time to meet with me today and really shed some light on PRN. We really, really appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah, I'm happy to be here and I appreciate you having me on here, Dr. Motycka.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to all of our listeners as well. We appreciate your support of the show. So please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and take care.